Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's free public webinar with TPC entitled The Most Impactful Changes to the 2023 National Electrical Code. My name is Ryan, your host for the evening, and I'll be taking your questions. And our presenter and instructor this evening is Mike Leitzel. He is one of our expert instructors today, and we're going to go through all the technical changes that we're seeing as the highlights of the National Electrical Code in this free informational session today. Before we hand it over to Mike, I thought I'd give you just a quick few details here about today's session. First and foremost, this session is being recorded, and this video recording of our presentation will be put up on our website within about 2 to 3 business days of today's date. And so be on the lookout for that, and from an email, you should be able to get that link to the recording. Also, at that time, you'll be able to access the PDF of these slides as well on our website, so be on the lookout for that. Thank you for your emails in advance of today's session. I wanted to answer a couple other quick curiosities and questions. First and foremost, this is a free informational session for everyone to get just some of the basic foundations of the National Electrical Code here from our experts at TPC. But because this is a free informational session, you're not going to get official continuing education units for this course. This is informational only. However, as you know, TPC and our partner organizations, Jade Learning and the American Safety Council, offer a lot of great training on the National Electrical Code. So definitely get into one of those digital self-paced courses or instructor-led courses on the National Electrical Code to get your official continuing education units for your license. And then finally, this session is live and in person right now for those of you tuning in. I see you all flowing in today. And because of that live nature, we welcome you to interact with us and ask some questions. So we have what we call a Q&A button. You'll see a Q&A button, and we really highly recommend you use that Q&A feature. You'll be able to type in a question, it'll come to us, and we'll be able to organize your questions for the instructor and for Mike at the end of the session, and we'll be able to answer them. Try to avoid posing your questions in the chat because we are not going to really be able to pay attention to the chat and keep it organized for you with all of you here. So definitely use that Q&A feature here. And then before I hand it over to Mike, I thought we'd start a little bit of interaction with you all to learn a little bit more about who's here, and by doing a little introductory poll with everyone. So we're going to do just ask a couple quick questions to you about your experiences with the National Electrical Code. So we're going to see this poll in 3, 2, 1 popping up on your screen. And what you can do is, as you see some of these folks, some of these questions, you'll be able to answer them just by clicking on them and scrolling down and answering all 4 questions on this little introductory poll. And then we're going to share those results with the audience today. Our first question to you is, how often do you find yourself opening up the National Electrical Code book, let's say digitally or in hard copy? Are you opening it once per day, once per week, maybe once per month or so? You can estimate once per year or pretty much almost never. We're seeing the answers coming in already. That's great. Question number 2, what areas do you work in? Do you work in residential? Do you work in commercial, like offices, schools, and hotels? Or are you working in industrial spaces, like manufacturing and production? And you can answer all that apply. You can select multiple if you like. Next question, what best describes your job position? Are you a code inspector? Are you a manager, supervisor? Would you say you are an engineer, an instructor, an educator of the code, or others? Are you a worker, like an electrician, maintenance technician, construction operator, that kind of thing, or other, maybe in another category? And finally, our last question for you, just to know who's here and how we can tailor our presentation today. How confident are you in your abilities of understanding the National Electrical Code? Are you very confident? Are you somewhat confident, or maybe neutral or somewhat unconfident in your abilities here? This is really, just to do a check on where you are with the National Electrical Code. Okay, we're seeing the answers coming in, and they're flowing in. I think they're starting to even out here in just a few moments. I think still some answers flowing in. We're going to give you about 5 more seconds to get your answers in. We got about 80% of you who have participated. That's a good amount. I think we're going to go ahead and end the poll. There we go. So that should have disappeared from your screen. And now what we'll do is share the results with you. Let's take a look. So we got all sorts of frequency all across the map. Once per day, 14% of you once per week, 23% of you once per month, 28% of you. So the winning answer, just by a narrow margin, 28% of you are opening this about once per month on average, which is fairly often on your job if you think about it, having to refer to this very large 800 plus page document. Those of you are most frequently working in commercial spaces, 59% of you, but I'm guessing a bunch of you are also working in industrial spaces as well, 57%. It was a dead heat. 59% of the answers answered commercial, 57% on industrial. What best describes your position? The majority of you here consider yourself an engineer, and that is 37%, followed closely by folks who are working in facilities, electricians, maintenance, construction, and service, etc. Great. And then finally, we see room for growth in our own skills for the National Electrical Codes. We're somewhat confident in our skills, 39%. So we see some room for growth, I think, based on that most popular answer. That really helps me and Mike really understand who's here today. So I'm going to stop sharing that result. So that window should have disappeared from your screen. And now, as we are about to get started with the official presentation, I want to make sure everyone here can see the presentation in front of you, which says changes to the National Electrical Code. And I highly recommend you make it as full screen as possible on your screen so you can see all the great detail we're about to cover with you. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mike Leitzel to continue chatting with you during today's session about the National Electrical Code. Thank you so much for being here, Mike.
Not a problem, Ryan. Thank you for the introduction. Those little poll questions actually do help me in understanding who my audience is. In doing these classes, in the training classes that I do, and even just interacting with people out in the field, I get a pretty wide variety of levels of ability, a very broad spectrum of job duties, responsibilities, so on and so forth. So that information kind of helps me understand who I'm talking to at any one time. Well, let's go ahead and get into this. Time tends to fly pretty quickly whenever you get involved with subject matter like this. It's that time again. We all know every 3 years, the code making panels have been spending a lot of time together answering public inputs, concerns, whatever you want to call it. As you can see here on the frame, over 4,000 inputs. Now, those inputs can be, suggestions, precautionary things. One of the things I admire about the way that this book is developed and the way that it evolves, it's not just some hidden secret panel of electrical oracles that get to sit around and decide what's good and what's not, what's safe and what's not. We all get to contribute to this if we choose to. The general public, contractors, workers, consumers, inspectors, whoever chooses, if they have a concern, if they have a suggestion for something that should be in the code book, the NFPA openly invites that information. In this particular edition, as you can see on the screen, out of those over 4,000 inputs, 1,800 of those became what is referred to as a first revision, which basically means that the suggestion, the concern has merit. It warranted discussion, consideration, and from those 1,800 first revisions, we had about 50% of them became second revisions, which I won't say that it's 100% that way, but the way that the majority of these things unfold, if something makes it to the second revision level of consideration, it's pretty much a given that it's going to make it into the code, unless something at the last minute is decided that maybe we'll put it on the back burner, maybe for a later time, maybe some reconsideration takes place, and for whatever reason, just hypothetically, they decide that they're not going to engage at this time. It happens, but typically all of those considerations, all of those discussions have taken place. By the time it makes it to a second revision, it's pretty much going to be some kind of change to the code. That being said, talking about changes, you can imagine in the, what, 45 minutes here, 40 minutes that we're going to take to talk about this, we could probably cover all 900 of those potential changes, but that would be what, about one every 3 seconds or something like that. You better brace yourself if we're going to try to get through all of them at that pace. Buckle your seatbelt and hold on. But as advertised, as discussed, we're going to try to approach this from, what are the most significant, from the perspective of the document itself, what are the most significant regarding what is probably expected to affect the most people in this line of work. Now, that being said, if your little world of the electrical trade involves, swimming pool wiring, or you work in a hospital, well then no, a lot of the changes that we talk about may not affect you at all. But it's a matter of, what did I find, or what did we find warranted the discussion here today. I, in no way, shape, or form am I going to be able to come anywhere close to covering all of what everybody considers a significant change, but we're going to do the best we can with the ones that we've mentioned here. Probably the biggest thing, if you haven't looked in this new edition yet, when you get a chance, one of the big things you're going to notice right out of the gate, they've rounded up all of the definitions that, generally the majority of them were in Article 100 already. But you had certain definitions that were located in articles where that was the only article in the code where that definition actually appeared. Which, I mean, it makes sense. If I have an article that really only applies, or a definition, I'm sorry, that only applies to, say, wiring practices around fairs and carnivals, something unique to just that little niche in the market, well, then it makes sense that that definition would only apply, or would only appear there in the code book. But the problem with it is, you may or may not know to go looking there for a definition. So the logic here is, let's gather all of the definitions that are scattered throughout, and let's put them in one place, one-stop shopping, so to speak. And then we'll clarify, which is what they did. If an article number appears after a specifically defined term, then what it's telling you is that is where that definition applies in that particular article. If no article number appears after the definition, well, then it may appear in numerous places throughout the document. I think it just makes more sense like that. That being said, we'll take a look at some of the other things that have taken place in Chapter 1, where only Articles 100 and 110 show up. I mentioned some changes to Article 100. If you look here, what, a dozen or so definitions. Now, not all of these are new. Not all of these would be surprising that they will be defined in Article 100. But one of the things that you'll see is there's been some tweaking of the language. They're trying to be a little more clear on the way some of the definitions, the way the sentencing is structured. They're trying to follow what is referred to as the style manual that more or less defines the way a lot of the structure should appear and the way it should flow in the document. There should be some uniformity to it. Along with that, one of the things they're trying to do is provide for, meaningful terminology within some of these definitions, to provide for the searchability of some electronic versions of this document. I know one of the things that I cover in my class quite often is the issue of, when you go to the index in the back of this book, as Ryan said, we have a document here that's 900 pages. In the index in the back, if you can come up with the key word or key phrase terminology, whatever you want to call it, for which is listed in the index, well, then you're golden. It will send you specifically to, most likely anyway, the part of the code that addresses your particular issue. But if you can't come up with that key word, you may find yourself just rummaging through the index, just scanning through and trying to find, that particular term that is going to serve your purpose. These search engines, the searchability of some of these electronic versions has that issue as well. You may enter a search term that seems 100% applicable to your particular concern, but it has to be logically associated with the subject matter that you're interested in. And I see a lot of this minor tweaking, minor adjusting in the future as this thing continues to evolve, and we'll all be served well by it, in the future. Some of the terms, accessible. Now, anyone in this trade, anyone that works in this line of work, somewhere early on learned about the word accessible. You had to understand the term accessible. Well, this is a perfect example of how they didn't necessarily redefine it, but they had to clarify a little bit. Let's call it reinforce here a little bit if you read it. They revised the definition to clarify that wiring and electrical equipment made inaccessible by piping, ductwork, drains, raceways, and so on is no longer considered accessible as applied to wiring methods. Anyone that's ever worked in this trade knows exactly what this is talking about. Other systems get added in places where there simply wasn't adequate room to have everything spread out, and final product ends up preventing our equipment, which is required to be accessible, from remaining accessible. So this is meant to clarify to not just us, but everybody that we work around, that this equipment needs to remain accessible even after we're done installing. The wiring and everything inside there requires us to be able to gain access to it. Here's another one. This really plays into what we were just talking about a moment ago with the index. The term likely to become energized, the one that I have underneath the underlined version, I did that on purpose. The term likely to become energized appeared more than 25 times in various locations through the previous edition. But nowhere did it ever specifically define what that actually means. Now, we all know with a term like that, when you see the word likely or words along that line, I know in the arc flash safety classes, we often have to discuss risk assessments and how risky something is. Well, that's a very subjective approach. So with this definition, they had to clearly define what it means for something to be likely to become energized. And it simply means that conductive material that could become energized because of the failure of electrical insulation or electrical spacing. So they're narrowing down what it is they're calling something that is likely to become energized. The key word here was likely. If you read in the second paragraph here, they needed to differentiate between equipment that can become energized and the equipment that we're discussing here that likely is to become energized. Big difference there, but they never actually really differentiated between it. Now, last thing before I move on, the reason why I put likely to become energized in parentheses after the underline version, energized, calmly, or common, or comma, likely to become, is the way that is listed in the definitions in Article 100. Herein lies another issue that we have to overcome sometimes in using this document. we know what we're looking for, whether it be a term or phrase or whatever, but do we know, or are we prepared for how it may be presented, or how we may need to structure the term or the clause in order to find where it's referred to in this document? It can be a real challenge sometimes to try to figure out what are they considering the key part of this term. And most people in this document, if they were looking up to see where the term likely to become energized would be defined, probably wouldn't be inclined to look up the word energized first. But that's how it's listed. This one, very interesting. They redefined or differentiated between these two. There was a lot of confusion between installers, enforcement personnel, inspectors, for lack of a better term. Basically, what we're striving for is we needed to clarify with concerns for certain types of receptacles, devices in general, that get mounted in countertops. Well, the listing, the design, the approval of certain types, certain styles of devices relies on, as we're mentioning here, the type of surface, the type of location where these things are installed. Well, a countertop, by definition now, a fixed or stationary surface, typically intended for food prep, serving, and I'm not going to go laundering, or similar service that presents a routine risk of spillage of large quantities of liquid. Well, if that's the case, in fact, they directly refer to them. The spillage of liquids would be upon outlets mounted directly on or in the surface. So some of these specialty receptacle arrangements that we've all seen or dealt with, where you have the ones that pop up out of the counter that have a seal that will protect spillage from getting down into the recesses where these receptacles are mounted. This is what some of these more specific definitions are geared toward. They even mention at the bottom here certain informational notes, and they're referring you to certain UL standards regarding these particular receptacles and where they're evaluated or where they're approved or intended to be used and where they're not. But this is a countertop. Now, a work surface is a fixed, stationary, or portable surface, typically intended for dry use and tasks other than food prep. The key difference here is where we have incidental risk of spillage of smaller quantities of beverage and other liquids. So a counter or a countertop is where we would expect, routinely expect the risk and likelihood of spillage of large quantities of liquid. Work surface primarily would be expected to be a dry location, where every now and then someone may spill a cup of coffee or spill a soda or whatever. But it's not expected that by the very nature of the location that quantities of spillage would be there and would take place. So they had to differentiate between these particular two locations in order for it to become more clear what type of location these different types of receptacles were intended to be installed in. So a lot of clarification, a lot of desire for better understanding, not just within the workers' world, but also within code enforcement as well. Here's one: servicing. You see the term, servicing of equipment, and then all of a sudden you look around and you see the term reconditioning. Depending on who you talk to, you may hear the term rebuilt thrown around. Well, they have to kind of differentiate between the two because there are certain concerns that the code is interested in with regards of at what point does typical service, maintenance procedures, and activities along that line, how much of that do you do on a piece of equipment before you've done so much to the point where we have to start considering it as a rebuild or a reconditioning, and not just excuse me, and not just servicing and maintenance? Because there are conditions in the code where if you have rebuilt or reconditioned equipment, you have to provide labeling, you have to provide identification of, what was done, when was it done, who did it, because technically, without getting into all of the other aspects of it, that's no longer a factory built piece of equipment whenever you tear something apart and clean it and spit polish it and make it look like brand new and then reassemble it again. It may be in exactly the same condition as it was when it arrived from the factory. It may even be in better shape. But the original manufacturer is no longer the person who built this particular piece of equipment. So they have to define the line, how much work can maintenance personnel or service personnel do to a piece of equipment with regards to repairs and replacements of parts and everything else before it's no longer considered servicing. It's now considered a rebuild or reconditioning. Another one, when the new code first came out, there was a lot of drama, big concern when this word came out. A lot of people were under the assumption that all of a sudden electrical contractors were going to have to be out here doing cybersecurity evaluations. No, all it is, they added a new line item here in 110.3 that puts in just an acknowledgement, you can even call it a reminder to contractors and everyone involved that network connected life safety equipment. Think about it. Hospitals have all kinds of different equipment that are tied into the network, tied into the internet. You have, robotic surgeries going on. There's all kinds of things, life safety related concerns that are tied into our networks and our internet networks. They just want to remind everyone to take the security of those setups into consideration, but it stops right there. It's not a mandate that an actual cybersecurity evaluation be done. At the bottom, they have informational notes as well to mention, different standards that can help you address these concerns depending on what it is that you're working with. Another one, you could have seen this coming. I'm surprised that it took this long. In the 70E, in the arc flash standard, they are very adamant that qualified persons be the people that are allowed to be in this area, are allowed to be exposed to these hazards, are allowed to enter into this boundary, so on and so forth. 110.17, with regards to the servicing and maintenance of equipment, now restricts that work to qualified persons. It requires the use of identified replacement parts that have been verified by, or according to certain standards. What they're talking about, replacement repair parts are to be provided by either original equipment manufacturers, individually designed by engineers with the applicable experience and knowledge, or in certain situations, approved by the AHJ, by the inspector. And that isn't always as cut and dried as is often thought of. The AHJ may or may not be all that knowledgeable within the scope of certain repair parts, replacement parts, engineering level, structural level type things. But it's still his responsibility as the person who is authorized to sign off on things to make sure that someone who is an expert with it can approve and say, okay, yeah, that's more than adequate. You know, that won't be a problem at all. And then the AHJ can sign off based on their approval. This is just laying the mandate that those approvals, that these things actually do take place. This one, I'm all for anything like this that makes life easier. 11022A is the one that requires a disconnect. But there's, and call it an exception or whatever, but it helps determine when the identification of a disconnect means is required. In this case, you got a hot water heater sitting there, disconnects right beside it. Pretty obvious why that thing's there. So they're just lightening up on the requirement that everything be identified. Sometimes you don't need an identification. It's painfully obvious just by what you're looking at why this thing is here, and they're allowing that to serve as such. Another issue, quite often, the floor around electrical equipment in situations like in the photograph and so many other examples is to be clear of trip hazards, objects lying around. The area should be level and flat as practical. One of the primary things that I've seen as an example here is, I think one of the latest photos, they had something a lot like this. And I think it was in a parking garage. And of course, you had the concrete parking blocks right there, 3 feet out from the wall where these panels are located. Well, talk about a trip hazard. That's what they're talking about, things like this. Especially when you're walking around, you have panels and covers open, there's energized components exposed, and you're already investing your attention in making sure nothing goes wrong in that department. Now you have to make sure you don't trip over anything on the floor as well. They're trying to do away with one of the things that might distract us or might cause an accident. 110.34A is the same thing, but for equipment over 1,000 volts. This is an interesting one. Ground fault protection has been expanded to include any cord and plug connected equipment in the kitchen, regardless of whether the outlet serves the countertop. They kind of explain here, electricians will need to be aware that ground fault protection is now required for all 125 volt through 250 volt receptacles within the kitchen, and not just those serving countertop locations. Little exception to the ground fault requirements. Apparently there was a lot of, I'll say what it was. I wasn't there, but I'm going to say what I know. It was a lot of arguing back and forth between installers and inspectors as to whether or not that little receptacle in the exhaust fan in a bathroom requires ground fault protection. Says here, it's been determined that these receptacles do not require ground fault protection unless required by, as part of the installation instructions or the listing that comes with the fixture. These aren't considered readily accessible, and they're installed integral to the exhaust fan assembly. So they're not too excited about whether or not ground fault protection is provided for these little guys. And I agree with it 100%. In other than dwelling units, these serving areas, buffet areas, things like this, GFI protection required. The location of cord and plug connected fixed or stationary appliances and not the receptacle will determine if GFCI protection is required. Used to be, measurements were made from, say, inside the sink, the inside edge of the sink bowl to the receptacle. Now it's from the inside edge to the fixed or stationary appliance itself. So they're recognizing, I guess, among other things, they're recognizing how gifted we are at finding ways to get shocked. So they have to adjust their zone of protection, I guess you could call it. This is a good one. You have old AC equipment like this sitting outside, been installed for quite some time. At the time that it was installed, it didn't require ground fault protection for anything. Well, this revision now requires ground fault protection be provided for outlets whenever older equipment that didn't require it is replaced. Kind of a reverse grandfathering thing. You're going to install a new unit, going to bring it up to date, got to bring the ground fault protection up to date with it. What we got here? Clarifying 15 amp branch circuits are permitted without all the code caveats here. 20 amp receptacles in a garage, fine. Well, they're saying here you can have 15 amp branch circuits. They're perfectly fine as long as they're in addition to the required 20 amp outlets. And then they even have a little caveat in here that exception number 2 allows the required 20 amp circuit supplying a single bay garage to supply other equipment. But that only applies to single bay garages. I think it's just an area of concern where they're looking at what people are trying to do with these branch circuits based on their rating, and they're just being clear as to what can be fed from what and what rating of circuit is required in certain locations. The whole arc fault section has been reformatted. I'm not going to say that there's a whole boatload of new material here, but it's being presented in a more structured manner. It says here that the revision was done to provide the user an easier way to find important references. The 10 amp branch circuit was added to the branch circuit sizes that are allowed for these locations. The subdivisions are now, subdivision A identifies means of protection. It lists all the protection methods available. Subdivision B for dwelling units, nice list format of all the locations requiring AFCI protection, both 10, 15, and 20 amp circuit outlets. Subdivision C deals with dormitory units, same concerns. And then subdivision D, they branch out into other occupancies. And then last but not least, they get into branch circuit wiring, extensions, modifications, or replacements. Bringing old wiring up to modern levels. How far out do we extend the latest and greatest code mandates? That's what Division E is going to be concerned with. Some direction was necessary. These 10 amp circuits. A 10 amp load can supply lighting outlets, or a 10 amp circuit can supply lighting outlets, lighting circuits for bathroom, laundry, dwelling unit exhaust fans, a gas fireplace. That's kind of what they were intended for. 10 amp circuits cannot supply receptacle outlets, fixed appliances, unless it's a specific individual branch circuit for one particular appliance, garage door openers, or laundry equipment. So 21023, they're just spelling out what a 10 amp branch circuit can and cannot be used for. Pretty clear. This one's going to get interesting for you guys in the residential world. The code previously required receptacles serving countertops for an island or peninsula. That whole thing has now been made optional. The outlet will no longer be allowed to be placed on the side of an island or a peninsular location. If a receptacle is desired, it'll need to be in or on the countertop or work surface. City ordinances or amendments may modify this code requirement. In the event a receptacle outlet is not provided for the island or countertop or work surface, the contractor must provide a method, a wiring method to the island or peninsula for future addition of an outlet, raceway, cable, whatever the case may be. But I think, and I would have to do a little bit more digging on this, I think part of the concern is receptacles on the side of peninsulas isn't inviting a cord being draped over the counter for kids to get their arm caught in, or for something to get yanked off of the countertop. And I think they're just trying to come up with a better way to address that need. Floor areas such as garages, unused or unfinished spaces are no longer excluded from the calculated floor area. Too often, space that was originally considered not adaptable for future use is often used as ancillary space, habitable portions of the dwelling. So they're just considering it all living space, whether or not it's used at the moment or not. Some new criteria in here for 14 gauge copper clad aluminum. With the cost of wire, I think everyone could see this coming. There's going to be a new welcoming of copper clad to the industry. Overcurrent protection device rating for the conductors can't exceed 10 amps for the so-called 14 gauge copper clad, but they're making room for it in the industry. There's a new Article 305 out there that was created for general wiring methods and installs applying to systems over 1,000 volts AC and 1,500 volts DC. The goal is to centrally locate information for what we're going to call medium voltage systems. The code has begun to expand a little bit in these little niches. IMC, trade size 5 and 6 IMC is now included as an acceptable wiring method. Same was done for RMC and EMT. A new article for insulated bus pipe, tubular covered conductors, new technology, new levels of acceptance for existing technology, code expanding, giving people other options. Flexible bus systems was given a new article, Article 371. Here's a good one. Snap switch terminations with the push-in, the so-called stab lock terminals in the back. 404.14D addresses concern that only solid copper conductors be used with push-in terminals. Additional evaluation still needs to be made regarding copper-clad aluminum in these terminals. 406.3D was changed similarly regarding concerns for 15 amp receptacles with push-in terminals. You get quite a mixed bag of feelings throughout the industry regarding people's approval or lack thereof of these snap locks or stab lock receptacles. There's no denying that they're quick, but I think this is a step in the right direction regarding, look, if we're going to use them, let's make sure that we use them with certain products for which much better suited. Surge protection for industrial control panels is a new requirement due to the fact that these panels are primarily assembled in the field. All of the parts used to assemble them are listed parts, but they still want surge protection for the entire panel itself. Language added requiring heating and air conditioning refrigeration disconnects that have hinged covers, and when open, exposed live parts be locked to prevent accidental contact. I guess because of the nature of the equipment, these types of disconnects didn't always have locking covers, and quite easily the wrong person for the wrong reason could get in there and expose themselves to shock hazard and or worse. 404.14 is a reference to 110.26A to make clear that working space clearances are required for heating and air conditioning refrigeration equipment disconnects, the same they are as for other equipment. There's a new table 13 in chapter 9 that gives a complete list of the types of protection for hazardous locations. The goal was improve the readability of 505.9. I've noticed in a lot of different places in this document, they're beginning to favor a list format. And I think it's a dandy idea. I really do. They created one where they list all of the individual appliances that require ground fault protection. I mean, that does away with so much ambiguity. If you look on the list, if the one you're working on in question isn't there, well, then guess what? It didn't make the list, so you don't have to worry about it. It makes it a lot easier, not just for installers, but also for enforcement. That ambiguity where your people aren't 100% sure based on what the code says and what it doesn't say, doesn't always work in everybody's favor. Another new industry called for another new article. 512, cannabis oil equipment, cannabis oil systems using flammable materials. There's been concerns among inspectors and so on and other industry members regarding fire and explosion hazards. associated with the equipment used to process and extract the plant oils from cannabis. So we have a new hazardous type of article. Healthcare facilities. I think this was coming for 1 or 2 code cycles. I'm not 100% sure how long it's been waiting in the wings, but they finally did away with the old critical, general, basic, and support related spaces in Article 517. Now it's simply category 1, 2, 3, and 4 spaces. I think once again, it's going to greatly simplify the application of these different, I want to call them zones, but they're not really zones, but helps line things up a little bit. And then in the interest of reducing charging time, some electrical vehicle manufacturers have specified larger capacity circuits for charging their vehicles. This change will now recognize single phase receptacles of up to 125, 250 volts and 60 amps for portable charging equipment. So folks, like I said, there's 900 changes. Some much more significant than others, depending on who you're talking to. But as a general rule, once again, if you look at what's changing and why it's changing, you start to see that, you know, the code is alive and well, and it's evolving as the industry is evolving. One of the things I will tell you, if you'd like to get a better understanding of why some of these code changes took place, look on the NFPA's website. If you do a little searching through there, you can actually read the notes from some of these discussions as to why they felt changes needed to be made. If there was a newfound recognition of a hazard that maybe wasn't seen before, it helps you understand the change itself if you understand what the driving force was behind it. Can't always do that, but when you can, it certainly helps. But we're running out of time, folks here. I mean, that's pretty much, as it says here, bear in mind, this was not a comprehensive collection. This just the ones that that kind of stood out to me. I think the ones that are going to have the widest effect throughout the industry. But as it says here, you know, always be sure, when in doubt. Guys, I'm an inspector myself. I have been for 20 some years. When in doubt, get on the phone, work with your inspector. Don't, I mean, you're inevitably going to butt heads with them somewhere along the line, but you're both trying to meet the same criteria that this document spells out for you. It's a lot easier to work with them than it is to constantly be at each other. If you're not 100% sure, it's a lot easier to make a phone call and say, hey, how would you like me to do this? As opposed to just do it the way you think it should be done and then find out that's not how he wants it. That just breeds discontent. So that being said, we'll open it up for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Mike, for sharing your wisdom on the National Electrical Code. We're actually getting some really great questions coming in about different curiosities about folks' areas. So for those of you, we're starting our Q&A. We got about 10 minutes to answer your questions. I'm going to start answering them in as chronological order as possible, but we're going to try to wrap some together to make sure we can get most of your questions answered. Feel free to continue using the Q&A, and we will do our best to continue answering your questions till the top of the hour. So just to let you all know, as you can see here, we got ways to continue learning, right? You can either jump on live.tpctraining.com and take a look at the NEC code courses coming up. We actually have 2 coming up virtually in February, or we can come to your facility and do however much code training in person. You might even see Mike himself at that class.
If anybody's interested, one of the things that I do stress in my training seminars is not just what's in the book, but how to use it. The NEC is a tool like anything else. If someone can show you the most effective way to use it, it's going to be a lot more agreeable and a lot more effective for you.
Definitely. And if you just got questions about what's out there and you're not sure, call the number 877-978-7246, or you can use the sales@tpctraining.com email address, and you'll be able to talk to someone who can really, they're one of our solutions experts, and we can just get you set up on whatever you want. So as well as Jade Learning, I want to give that a quick call out too. Jade Learning is our digital offering for self-paced learning on your own time for the National Electrical Code for CEUs. I know a couple of you here in the Q&A were asking about, am I getting personal development hours or continuing education unit CEUs? And for this session, the answer is no, because there's a live, 1 hour free session for informational purposes. But if you hop on to jadelearning.com or to our live.tpctraining.com, you can definitely attend an official training that can be useful for CEU purposes. So that being said, let's go into some of the technical questions, Mike. The thing I'm noticing in our first batch of questions is some curiosity about refrigerators. As we were talking about kitchens earlier, we had some folks interested in different areas of refrigerators. I'm going to try to boil them down. But let me start with, in terms of accessibility, is the inaccessibility of a refrigerator receptacle kind of excluded in that? What do you think about that?
Well, one of the things that is driving the concern with ground fault protection is the general public has begun to wave and move toward metallic outer shells of appliances now, where they used to be plastic and vinyl. And with the growing popularity of more metal outside surfaces on our appliances, they're beginning to favor the application of ground fault protection on these things. Regardless, I mean, I know everyone, anytime I do a code class anymore, I get questions along those lines about, I can't believe they want a refrigerator on a ground fault device. I can't believe they want a sump pump on a ground fault device. They're weighing the shock risk against the inevitable inconvenience of having a nuisance trip. I'm not saying that you're not going to have nuisance trips. I think we're always going to have them, but I honestly believe that the frequency of nuisance trips that we see with the modern level of quality in ground fault devices isn't nearly as high as what we think. I think a lot of times when a ground fault device trips, it is an honest to goodness issue. It's something that the ground fault device reacted to. As far as the inaccessibility about the receptacle behind the refrigerator, yeah, I mean, that is, if that wasn't ground fault protected, the fact that it's behind the refrigerator would preclude someone from being able to plug into the other half of, say, a duplex receptacle and be using something that they would need ground fault protection on and not have it. But what they're favoring, as I say, isn't just the protection of the unused portion of a duplex receptacle. They want ground fault protection for that appliance.
Definitely.
And that, I think this argument is going to go back and forth for a couple of years. I really do.
Yeah, and then it comes out to the the interpretability of the National Electrical Code that isn't necessarily set in stone one way or another, isn't it?
No, and that's the beauty of it. They may waver back the other way in 2026.
Definitely. Let's see. So some quick, maybe rapid fire questions here. How would you comment on this question? It's probably definitely more simple than it seems, and that is, what size wire should be used on a 10 amp circuit, and why can you or can you not answer that question right off the bat?
Well, they were spelling out with, I'm trying to think of what that code article was. I had it on my mind earlier. They actually spelled this out specifically, where they were limiting the use of these conductor sizes for specific circuits, but they also, I think they were limiting the wire size. I'd have to look it up. I can't remember what it was. The 16 and 18 gauge wire has, for the most part, I think, been expected to be used in like motor control cabinets, where it's going to see a very limited amount of current. But I would actually have to look at, in fact, while I'm sitting here, I'll see if I can whip out 31016 here and see if it said anything specifically about it.
Sure. That's great. And thank you for the question. And as Mike's looking into that, we definitely got a really, I think good overarching question, which I think applies to lots of areas. I know in NFPA 70E and the code is, what does qualified mean? We used that a couple times. Thanks, Tim, for that question. Definitely qualified is a powerful term, and it kind of allows folks to get into, and we at TPC get into the argument and the discussions in almost every class we teach about, are you qualified? What does it mean to be qualified? How do you know you're qualified? But in short, I know I can start the discussion anyway on qualified, and Mike, you can put a nice bow on it, and
Yeah,
that is,
fine.
yeah, that you got those skills and knowledge and safety training required to be qualified. So how much skills is enough skills, Tim? How much knowledge is enough knowledge? And how much safety training is enough safety training to be considered qualified? It's not up to Mike, and it's not up to me, and it's not even up to OSHA necessarily to say how much is enough. It's up to your employer, because they're the ones on the hook and accountable for your safety. So whatever the employer says it takes to be qualified, maybe one employer will require 5 years of training to be qualified versus one employer will say, you know what, your tradesman license that you're coming in right out of the door will be your qualification. Some might require a high school degree, some might not. Some might require a college degree, some might not. Some might require hours of on-the-job training, some might not. It really depends. Some, all the different requirements from place to place. But definitely it is the employer who is responsible for your qualification, Tim. Hopefully that helps. And Mike, would you like to add anything about what it means to be qualified?
Well, you pretty much nailed it hit the nail on the head. When it comes to qualified, the definition in the safety standards is basically, to be considered qualified, you have to be knowledgeable about the construction and the operation of the particular equipment that you're about to work on. You need to be knowledgeable enough to properly assess the risk associated with what it is that you're about to do. You'd be able to recognize the hazards, to have the safety training and the knowledge to know how to mitigate those hazards as best you can. So it basically, in unofficial terms, do you know enough about the equipment to know how it can hurt you, whether it be mechanically, electrically, or whatever? Mm-hmm. Do you know enough about the equipment and what it is you've come to do on the equipment to know how much danger, how much of a hazard you're going to be in with what it is you've come to do, whether it's energized work, whether it's mechanical hazard, whatever the particular hazards happen to be? And then, have you had the safety training, and are you trained in how to, if not totally eliminate the hazards, at least reduce them down to their minimum level, which that's what we all want anyway, so we don't have to wear as much PPE. But the term qualified worker or qualified person is always going to have to be looked at within the scope of the task or the particular piece of equipment that's about to be worked on. It tends to show up as this broad-based, almost like an umbrella term, where, hey, am I a qualified person or am I not? Well, yeah, in general, but more specifically, are you qualified with regards to working on this piece of equipment? So it can be applied in broad spectrum, but it also has to be applied quite specifically.
Definitely.
If the task at hand is going to call for you to do something you've never done before or work on a piece of equipment you've never seen before, the idea of you being qualified to do that really gets interesting.
Right. Hey, well, thank you so much for that question, Tim, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, Mike. We have run out of time for this hour-long informational session, and we want to honor your hour here with us by letting you continue on with your days. But I will say, man, we got some really wonderful questions from every one of you. Curious about GFCIs and AFCIs and the adoption state by state, and all sorts of different ins and outs of microgrids versus versus, oh man, what are all the stuff? We got getting lots of questions, and all I can really say to that is get those questions answered by going to an official training session with someone like Mike, one of our instructors,
Oh,
and you'll have the
Ryan,
room in those 2 days
the
to
other
get.
question that we had that I didn't address, Ryan, 18
Yes.
gauge copper is
Oh
allowed
yeah.
to be shown 7 amps, no more than 5.6 amps continuously.
Ah.
16 gauge is allowed to see 10 amps, no more than 8 amps continuously.
Mm-hmm.
Tell them if they want to see that, that's in Article 240.4D.
Excellent. Thank you.
Alrighty.
And that really helps. And yeah, you can get into chapter 2 of that code and get into all those tables that we love so much.
Oh, yes.
Thank you all for your wonderful questions. And thank you, Mike, for telling us all the latest on the National Electrical Code this year. I wish you all a great day. Be on the lookout for the recording of today's session on our website within 2 to 3 business days, including the PDF of today's presentation. Thank you very much and have a great and wonderful day, everyone.